It's roughly 200,000 years ago. You're human, barely, but still. You live in a small group of maybe 30 people on the edge of a forest in what will eventually become East Africa. You eat, you sleep, you move, you survive. And at some point, without anyone explaining it, without a conversation, without a book, without the deeply awkward middle school health class that scarred an entire generation of modern humans, you figured out sex, not just the act, the meaning of it. And that second part, the meaning, is the part that almost nobody talks about, because the act itself is not the interesting question. Animals do it, insects do it, things with no brain to speak of do it. The interesting question is what happened in the human mind when we started doing it consciously, when we started choosing it, thinking about it, building rules around it, telling stories about it, painting it on cave walls, and turning it into something that would eventually generate more anxiety, poetry, religion, war, and very complicated feelings than almost anything else in human experience. That transformation from biology to meaning is one of the most extraordinary things our species ever did, and figuring out when it happened and how is genuinely one of the harder problems in all of archaeology. Let's start with the obvious thing that needs to be said, and then immediately set aside. Animals reproduce without understanding reproduction. A dog does not connect the act with the eventual appearance of puppies 6 weeks later. The cognitive gap between doing a thing and understanding the causal chain that thing produces is enormous. And for most of evolutionary history, humans were on the wrong side of it. The connection between sex and pregnancy is not intuitive. It requires you to observe a pattern across a delay of 9 months, connect two events separated by seasons, and construct an invisible causal link between them. That is abstract reasoning. That is the kind of thinking that separates humans from almost everything else alive, and it did not appear overnight, which means that for a very long period of human prehistory, the act existed, the understanding did not. And the question of when exactly that understanding arrived is one that researchers genuinely argue about, because you cannot carbon date a thought. Here is what we do know. The neurological hardware required for that kind of abstract causal reasoning, for understanding that action A produces consequence B across a 9-month gap, appears to have come online somewhere in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the emergence of modern Homo sapiens. The same cognitive leap that gave us language, symbolic thinking, and the ability to plan for a future we couldn't see also gave us the capacity to look at a pregnant woman and eventually, slowly, over generations of observation, make the connection. But eventually is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because even once the cognitive capacity was there, the pattern recognition still required time, sustained, careful observation across an enormous number of births, correlating behavior with outcome across seasons and years, noticing exceptions, babies born to women who seemed not to have had recent partners, pregnancies that didn't result in birth, all the noise that obscures the signal. This is the thing about early human knowledge that modern people consistently underestimate. It wasn't discovered in a single moment. It was assembled slowly, imperfectly, collaboratively, across hundreds of generations of people watching the world and talking to each other about what they saw. And they did talk, constantly, about everything. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups show that a striking proportion of social conversation involves reproduction, relationships, and the behavior of other group members in that domain. Gossip, in other words, which is not trivial. Gossip about who is sleeping with whom, who just became pregnant, whose child looks like whom, is precisely the kind of sustained social data collection that would, over enough time, produce the raw material for understanding the connection between sex and birth. The group collectively figured it out before any individual did. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange. There is a theory, taken seriously by a meaningful number of anthropologists, that some early human cultures may have attributed pregnancy not to any single act of sex, but to a kind of accumulated process. The idea being that pregnancy was understood as the result of repeated sex over time, rather than a single encounter. Some contemporary hunter-gatherer societies in Papua New Guinea and parts of South America held or still hold versions of this belief. The idea that a growing fetus requires continued contributions from a male partner to develop fully. This sounds wrong to a modern ear, but it is not an unreasonable conclusion to reach if you are working from observation alone, without the benefit of microscopy or genetics, or any understanding of what is actually happening at a cellular level inside a human body. If pregnancy consistently follows sustained sexual partnership, the correlation holds. The mechanism is invisible. You explain what you can see. These societies also sometimes practiced what is called partible paternity, the belief that a child can have multiple fathers, each of whom contributed to its creation. And far from being socially destabilizing, this belief often produced more stable outcomes for children because it distributed the social obligation of paternity across multiple men, all of whom had some investment in the child's survival. Ancient humans, it turns out, were not less sophisticated about sex than we are. They were differently sophisticated, working with incomplete information and producing social arrangements that in some cases held up reasonably well for the people inside them. Now let's talk about what the physical evidence actually tells us. Because the archaeology of sex is real, and it is strange, and it goes back further than most people expect. The oldest known depictions of human sexuality in art date to the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago in Europe. The famous Venus figurines, small carved female forms with exaggerated hips, abdomens, and breasts, appear across a vast geographical spread from Western Europe to Siberia, hundreds of them, made by many different hands, across thousands of years. The specific meaning remains genuinely contested. Fertility symbols, representations of goddesses, teaching tools, objects of desire, identity objects for women themselves. Nobody knows for certain, but the obsession they represent is unmistakable. These were things people made deliberately, carefully, repeatedly, across enormous distances of time and space. Someone sat down with a piece of ivory or stone and spent hours carving a body. That is not an accident. That is a mind that had decided the body, specifically the female reproductive body, meant something worth capturing, preserving, making permanent. That is the leap. That is the thing that separates what ancient humans were doing with sex from what every other animal on the planet was doing with it. They were making it mean something, and the moment it meant something, everything else followed. Rules about who could sleep with whom, rituals marking the transition to adulthood, stories explaining where children came from, because every human culture in history has had to answer that question for its children. And the answers, before modern biology, were spectacularly creative. Taboos that encoded real social logic in the language of the sacred. Ideas about love that started around fires in the dark and ended up in every poem ever written. The discovery of sex as a biological act was probably too gradual to have a single moment. But the discovery of sex as something that carries weight, meaning, consequence, beauty, danger, and an almost overwhelming amount of human feeling that happened somewhere in the long middle stretch of our prehistory, in the minds of people who had no words for most of what they were figuring out. They worked it out the way they worked everything out, together, slowly, around fires, talking, and then they carved it into stone so carefully that we are still finding those carvings today, still looking at them, still trying to understand exactly what those hands were trying to say across 40,000 years of silence. Some questions, it turns out, do not get simpler the longer you sit with them. They just get more human.